how is it that at parent-teacher conferences, the parents you really want to see never show up, but the students that are doing exceptionally well, those parents come?
Parent-teacher conference.
When I first started teaching, parent-teacher conference scared the poop out of me, man, because I didn't know what to say or what to do, and I was just so unsure about myself. So in this video, I want to give you some insights on how to handle parent-teacher conferences and give you some tips on when we actually are communicating with those parents. The first thing you want to do is you want to know your students' grades. Now, at our parent-teacher conference, a lot of times we'll have our computer in front of us so we can quickly look up the other grades if you need to be. But if you don't, you want to make sure you print out the students' grades, because the last thing you do, that's usually the first question a parent has for you is, how's my student doing in your class? How's my son or daughter doing in your class? If you cannot give them that simple answer of, oh, they have A, B, C, or whatever else it is, it puts you in a bad light. It shows that you don't know really what's going on in your classroom. So you want to make sure you're able to answer that question effectively and quickly. Now, the students that are doing poorly, you want to make a mental note of that, because if those parents come, you want to definitely be able to talk to them, communicate with them. But in general, just have access to students' grades one way or the other, either computer or print it out, so that way when you get that question, you can give them an answer. The next thing you want to do is you want to know students' interventions. There are plenty of students on your roster. I know on my roster, I have about I would say a fourth of the students have some sort of kind of intervention one way or the other. You want to make sure you know which students have those interventions and what those interventions are. Because if a parent is coming to you, they're pretty aware of where, the interventions the student have, the skills they're lacking, and they want to see what you are doing for them. And so you want to be at least aware of what students have those interventions, 504 plans, IEPs, all of those things. And then you want to make sure that you are actually doing something extra for those students, whatever that may look like. In my time, many times for me, I have an aide that comes in, or I might give students extra time on their assignment. Whatever it is, you got to know the students and you got to have something put in place, so that way when parents ask you what you're doing for their child specifically that has some sort of intervention, you can communicate that to them. The third thing you want to know about your students is know their patterns. And so what I mean by this, there are some students that routinely seem to be out of the classroom, maybe using a restroom pass, or maybe are constantly disruptive in your class, or maybe always have gum or have their cell phones out. You want to be able to identify those students and those patterns. Now, the good news is you're going to have more students than not that have no patterns at all. They come in and do what they need to do. But there's going to be a good handful that there's something you want to address with the parents. And by saying, hey, I just have this problem with the student, is not so clear. But if you could say, I noticed in this past week, they've gone out of the classroom 3 times, that is much more powerful than saying, yeah, they use the restroom a lot. If you quantitate it, I think it is, how many times they've done something, that gives it a little more solid foundation when you communicate with the parents. But keep track of the patterns, find some systems for keeping that out. I use my seating chart, another video for that one. But however you keep track, just make sure you're able to communicate that with the parents, certain patterns you see with some of the students. The next thing is you want to know how your students are doing in other classes. Now, here's a reason why. Because if a student is failing my class and I look on their grades, and they're failing all the other classes, that gives me a good idea that I'm not the issue, right? But if I look at a student's grades and they're failing my class and they have A's and B's in other classes, there's a problem there. Something's not in sync with me and that student. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe we're just not working together effectively. Maybe I'm not holding them accountable. Whatever, there's something going on with that student and me. You want to know about that, because the last thing you want to do is be at this parent-teacher conference. They're like, yeah, they got good grades, except for your class, they're not failing. What's happening? And if you're like, well, they're not doing the work, they're like, but they're doing the work in other classes. What's different about yours? And so you want to be able to identify those students that are different from your class and other classes. Now, if they're failing your class and failing other classes, you're okay. But if they're doing well in all the others, but somehow something's going with yours, you want to make sure you know who they are and have a response ready to go for the parents. You could say something, I noticed that too, that they were doing good in the class, but failing my class. well, here's something I worked out with your son or daughter. Here's something that we can do. You want to have an answer for that. So just be aware of how students are doing in your class versus the other classes. Another tip is remain calm. Remain calm. Now, it's going to be pretty easy with most parents, right? You might be a little nervous, understandable. I still get a little nervous as well. But if a parent starts to confront you, now, if they're like totally yelling at you, that's a different story. I mean, should come in and support you, everything else. But if a student is starting to, or if a parent's starting to question your ability as a teacher, it'd be so easy to get frustrated about, especially if that student is misbehaving in your class. You're like, well, it's not my fault, it's your son or daughter's fault. That gets nowhere. You do not want to get in an argument with a parent. Even if you are right, do not get in an argument with a parent. You want to remain calm. And no matter what they say or do, just try to retain that. Because if you get worked up, then that's when things can escalate. And you trust me, you do not want that. So if something's going on and there's an interaction and they are upset, try to de-escalate the best you can. You still need to address things. You still need to talk to them. You still need to find solutions. But whatever it takes, just keep that even tone so that way you can better deal with parents. When addressing behavior for a student, focus on behavior, not the student. This is because as a father, I have 3 kids. If I hear anybody talk negatively about them, it upsets me. Even if my son or daughter is doing something, it still upsets me to hear the negative thing. And if I believe that they're making it personal against my son or daughter, I definitely would get upset. Parents are the same that you're talking to, right? And they don't want to hear negative behavior or bad information about their son. Sometimes they know it already, but they still don't want to hear it. So this is what you want to do. If you need to address behavior, you want to focus on the behavior, not the student. So let's use Johnny as an example here. So Johnny comes up with his mom and dad. Johnny's been very disruptive in my class, right? But Johnny comes up with his parents, and I do the handshake, everything else, and time for me to address behavior. I say, hey, one thing I noticed, a lot of times when I'm in the classroom giving a lecture, Johnny's in the back talking or being somewhat disruptive. So I just wanted to bring that up to see if we can reach some sort of understanding about it. And she might look at Johnny, what's going on, blah, blah, and Johnny might say something. All right. But what you don't want to say is, hey, Johnny's rude, he's disruptive, he's bad. Don't say all these things. Don't say Johnny is this. You say Johnny is doing this. All right. Not Johnny is disruptive. Johnny is bad. Johnny is displaying disruptive behavior. Johnny is distracting the class. So when you take away from the person themselves and focus on the behavior, it's easier for the parents to handle, and it's easier for you to work with on a solution. Next thing is have a script. Now, in fact, if you want to, I created this little template that has scripts on it, how to communicate with parents. And so if you're interested in that, look in the description down below, and there's a link for that, and you can in the scripts I use. But the idea behind a script is you don't want to be methodical when you say, you don't want to sound like a robot, but you want to have some sort of idea how to say things. Otherwise, you could find yourself getting into a little bit of trouble, right? So give you an example. Just kind of go through different scenarios of how they may play out, and then use a script just to at least formulate your mind. And then, of course, when you're talking with parents, you don't have to follow exactly. You're not going to read it word for word, but at least you have an idea of what to say, and more importantly, maybe how to say it. For example, if a parent is upset because they feel like I'm singling out their son or daughter, they feel maybe that I'm treating them unfairly because there's other students behaving a certain way, whatever else it might be. Here's kind of something I would say. I would say, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I can promise you I'm not singling out your son or daughter. My whole goal for this classroom is for them to be successful as well as the other students to be successful. And so I have to address the behavior going on there because it affects everybody else. And so by saying that, that script, it kind of, once again, takes the attention off them as a person and addresses the parents' concerns. It keeps it down, not quite as escalating. But that's an example of a script that I would use. But regardless of what it is, think about it beforehand, how you would phrase something, so that way to make it as smooth as possible. You need to understand this. More often than not, it's not you. All right? More often than not, it's not you. Parents know their kids. They know their kids. They know the goods and the bads of their sons, and more often they know they probably know the kids better than you do, right? So they know their behavior. And so if a student has a pattern of negative behavior in your class, other classes, previous years, everything else, and a parent is upset at you for the way you're addressing it, it's not you. It is not you, right? The student is acting a certain way they shouldn't be, and now you have to deal with it. And many times, some parents get defensive over it, and they might get upset at you for that as well. But you have to rest assured in the idea that knowing that more often than not, it is the student and the parents and not you. So kind of put that in your mind. You're doing the best that you can for all your students in your classroom. And regardless of how your class is overall, each student has a responsibility to act appropriately. And if they don't, then of course that's something that needs to be addressed. So once again, more often than not, it's not you, it is them. Now the flip side of that is this, that if there is a problem, if you did make a mistake, you got to own it. If you messed up, you need to own it. I remember one time, I forgot exactly what was going on in my class, but I yelled at a student. The behavior or something, I forget exactly the details, but I yelled at a student. Later on that day, I get a call from their parent. Their parent told me that that student was really not only upset, but was scared by the way I yelled at them. And I thought back, now don't get me wrong, the student was acting inappropriately. They were not following the rules. They were being disruptive, this, and all these, they were in the wrong. So I had every right to address their behavior. But my mistake was the way I did it. I lost my temper. I got frustrated. I got upset when, and once again, that's human nature. It's going to happen. I don't want you to think I'm perfect. I make plenty of mistakes. I get upset. But because I got upset, because I did not remain calm, that overflowed onto the student, even though he wasn't wrong. And then, of course, I got a phone call about that. So I had to own that. I had to tell the parent, you know what? You're 100% right. I shouldn't have yelled at your student. I mean, regardless of how they act in a class, there was a better way for me to handle it. I did handle it inappropriately. I'm going to talk with the student. I'm going to apologize to them for the way I acted. And I did. You got to own it. If you don't own it, you're never going to get the student's trust, and you're never going to get the parent's trust. So if you mess up, own it. And this is probably the most important one here. You need to have solutions ready. So if a student is misbehaving in your class and you're addressing it with the parents, you just don't want to address it and bring it out in the open. You want to have solution. You would tell them, back to Johnny, here's what I'm thinking we could do with Johnny. If you're okay with this, we can basically have, we call them a long step for Johnny. We're checking with me every day and I have to sign something off, right? And then that way he can give it to you. That way we keep track of his behavior. Or, how's this sound as a solution? Let me get your email, and if there's any problems, I will email you what's going on. So that way nothing comes as a surprise. So whatever it is, you want to have solutions on how to deal with different things. So behavior, those are some examples of behavior, but definitely for grades as well. If a student is failing your class, you don't want to say, yep, they're failing, I don't know what to do, what to tell you, they can do better next time. That's not what parents want to hear. Parents want to hear, like, my son, daughter is failing, well, what can they do to bring it up? And you want to have an answer for that. For my class, I have something called extra credit. Students can always do extra credit. Even if they're not behind, missing the class, whatever, they can always do extra credit. And so that catch-on, and students can always make up tests. So having those two things in place are ways in which students can bring up their grade. So if a parent comes to me and says, well, that's, thanks for letting me know the students fail, but what can they do? I can say, well, there's always extra credit, and they can always make up these tests. Now, whether or not the student does it, or whether or not parents hold them accountable, that's a different story. But at least by having those things there, I have a solution to the problem of bad grades. So you want to make sure when you go into the parent-teacher conferences, you have solutions ready for the parents.